What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So getting into the origin of the first lantern ring, this is really cool to me because keep in mind, while I have read Jeff John's run in preparation for the videos that we do every Sunday, for the most part, I'm only maybe a year removed, if that, from like his stories. A lot of people have been reading them for years. Like they were reading it when it first came out and they were following it all the way along, this huge 10-year epic. And so for them, like a lot of this stuff is old hat, but for me, it's really brand new in a lot of different ways. But the origin of the first lantern ring is actually new material. Keep in mind, Volthoom was a character who appeared in Jeff John's Green Lantern run as just this guy who was there. He was just the first lantern, the first person to ever tap into the emotional spectrum. We didn't know his origin. We didn't really know where he hailed from. He was just there one day. He was just this prisoner that the Guardians of the Universe have been keeping for quite some time. And then finally he emerged and basically cut a swath through the entirety of all the Lantern Corps. So again, it was really cool to see that whole thing unfold. But what DC's done with regards to Green Lantern's Rebirth is, remember, Green Lantern's Rebirth is basically the new comic reader's guide to the Green Lantern universe, to basically everything that goes on with the different corps and different things like that. Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps is more for established fans, those who have basically been reading everything that Jeff Johns had done, and it's a way to basically reward their loyalty with a continuation of what they're already familiar with. But for those of you guys who are new, Green Lanterns is really where you want to start. And so because of this, Volthoom's origin had largely been fleshed out in DC Rebirth. And all we knew was that Volthoom was basically a guy who had hailed from a different universe, this being who was basically trying to prevent the collapse or the destruction of his own planet at the hands of some unknown being, some unknown force. And the result was that he and his mother, I believe it was, had basically created something called the Travel Lantern. And the Travel Lantern had allowed individuals who were able to use it to basically traverse one universe to the next. It was literally a key to access any and all dimensions that existed in the DC multiverse. And so because of this, while Volthoom's journey took him to different universes and those had different results, ultimately he settled in the main DC universe and then ultimately was the person that allowed the Guardians to begin tapping into the emotional spectrum. Now, it wasn't something the Guardians knew that they were doing. Instead, it was basically Volthoom showing up and saying, hey, you guys are super advanced and super knowledgeable. Maybe you can help me find a way to save my home planet. And so the result is that working alongside the Guardians of the Universe, the Guardians had their own course. They had basically come to the conclusion on their own that emotion was the biggest cause of all problems that existed. If they were devoid of emotion, they could be pure logical. And the result was that when they cast their emotions aside, when they pulled them all together, it ended up tapping into the emotional spectrum and spitting out the first lantern ring. Now, when it comes to the emotional spectrum, and we've talked about this before, and again, bear with me for those people who are new and haven't seen this before. The idea of the emotional spectrum is that it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the emotions that exist within the DC universe. Rage, greed, fear, willpower, hope, compassion, love, death, life. But remember, the arrival of Volthoom and the Guardians of the Universe casting their emotions aside, this is basically just two paths that happen to meet each other. And so with the spewing out of this lantern ring, or I guess this first lantern ring, what it's done is it's brought the two groups together because what they know is this ring basically channels the emotional spectrum. Now, one thing that I do want to talk about, and we'll actually talk about this once we get towards the end of the video, is the first lantern ring versus the white lantern ring, because that's one of the questions that I get quite a bit. And it's actually a pretty interesting question. It's pretty legit, and it really is an interesting topic to discuss. But the idea here is that because of the fact that Volthoom is very much curious about the Guardians as they are about him, and the fact that his ring simply isn't working at the moment, the biggest question the Guardians of the Universe have is, how does Volthoom's ring work? Now, keep in mind, this also fits very neatly within the realm of DC's whole, Guardians of the Universe chronology, which is to say that historically speaking, even before Jeff Johns took over the Green Lantern run, after the Guardians had cast aside their emotions, they actually began to shrink in size down to the beings that we're most commonly familiar with when we think of Guardians of the Universe. And that's something that like Rami hits on. Rami's basically this new character who was introduced as part of DC Rebirth, this guy who was basically the smartest of all the Guardians, kind of like their tech guy basically, and he's the one that essentially is trying to work behind the scenes and figure out how this ring works directly with Volthoom. Now, in truth, this is not really a sanctioned act. It's not really something that the Guardians of the Universe are okay with per se. It's really just the two of them working side by side because the other Guardians can't really figure out what's going on. Now, the other indication here is that Rami is really the only person who can actually figure it out, because with him being as smart as he is, he looks around at the other Guardians and says, maybe they're just looking at it all the wrong way. And the reason for this is because Rami's logic dictates that if the ring was spewed out from the emotional spectrum, then maybe it's not a matter of like forcing it to work. Maybe it's not a matter of technology. Maybe it's a matter of emotion. And so at that moment, he basically says, if it's part of the emotional spectrum, then think of a moment in your life that made you scared or made you really angry or whatever the case may be. And in this moment, Volthoom channels the entirety of the emotional spectrum. Now, the reason for this is because of the fact that he's experiencing a wide array of emotions at the same time. He's afraid that he's going to lose the planet that he cares about. He's going to lose those that are closer to him. Because of the fact that he's afraid of their deaths, it means that he loves them. And so there's compassion. There's also the idea that he's angry at the fact that he feels helpless in being able to stop it, but he has the will to try to overcome this. You guys see where I'm coming from? He's experiencing the entire emotional spectrum all at the same time. The problem with this is that being able to manipulate the entirety of the emotional spectrum comes with the idea that this is now unchecked and unrivaled power within the DC universe proper. Now, the other half of this is that because Volthoom is basically using the travel lantern, the logic of Rami is to say, okay, if the travel lantern can be used to basically jump from one universe to the other, then essentially it's part and parcel to Volthoom himself. And so the result is that the lantern's actually placed inside of Volthoom. It becomes a physical part of his body's structure. The issue with this is that with Rami using the travel lantern to basically look into the universe that Volthoom hails from, what he ends up finding out is the destruction of Volthoom's planet was by Volthoom himself. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He had basically lost his mind. He had gone awry with all the power that he possessed. Now, the initial attempt by Rami is to basically stop this from happening, is to stop this and say, hey, look, you're the reason why your world ends up getting destroyed. You basically get drunk with power, you lose your mind, you basically become this force of nature. Now notice, as Volthoom is given this information, he literally starts experiencing the emotional spectrum one core at a time. So it's, why would you accuse me of such a thing? That's rage. He switches to red. Then it's, well, God, if I did that, then, I mean, am I really going to become that person? I'm horrified of the fact that I could actually do something like that. That's fear. Now, the reason why fear is so important when it comes to the emotional spectrum is it's the idea that it all starts with fear. It's the idea that anybody who basically comes across a situation that they cannot comprehend and cannot understand and are terrified of the consequences that will befall them because of the situation outside of their control, or at least perceived to be outside of their control, will act out of fear. And this is exactly what happens with Volthoom. He literally lashes out at the Guardians of the Universe when they try to strip him of his power, when they try to basically say, you cannot use this. You cannot be the person that you are at the moment. You cannot be this villain. We're going to take this travel lantern away from you. We're going to take this ring away from you. Volthoom ends up saying no, and the response is that he's just kind of like, whatever, I'm going to go off and do my own thing. Now, what this does is this leads into the introduction of the 7 original lanterns, in the sense that with Rami realizing that Volthoom is basically beyond control here, or at least beyond the Guardians of the Universe's ability to control, what he does is he creates 7 lantern rings, 7 green lantern rings, and then disperses those lantern rings out into the universe, basically creating the original 7 green lanterns. But getting into our discussion about this whole idea of the white lantern ring versus the first ring, in truth, it's not really a battle of rings per se. It's not really like Volthoom is using this ring to basically do whatever it is that he wants. Volthoom is actually mainlining the emotional spectrum. He's using the entirety of the emotional spectrum at his disposal. And there's a difference here. The white lantern ring comes when a person is basically able to master, control, and bring together the 7 lantern cores. And what that ended up doing was creating the white light. Now, of course, that goes into, the aftermath of Blackest Night going into Brightest Day, so on and so forth. But when it comes to a white lantern, it's really them just using the entirety of the rings as opposed to mainlining the emotional spectrum. And so in this instance, it's really like Volthoom, I would argue, would probably come out on top here. He's not using a battery, he's not using an electrical outlet. Like, he is the electricity. He's basically the source of energy. He is the emotional spectrum in a lot of ways, because instead of, going through this and then through that and then through that and getting to the emotional spectrum, he's just going directly to the source. I don't know if that really makes a whole lot of sense. Hopefully it does, but that's essentially the difference here. As Kyle Rayner is, or I guess as the White Lantern, is using the 7 lantern rings together as one cohesive unit and creating a White Lantern ring. With Volthoom, it's not even going through that step. Instead, it's just using the entirety of the emotional spectrum. So again, it's basically, you know, using the source itself as opposed to what the source could possibly create. Kind of one of those weird, ambiguous things. Hopefully that made sense, but it's a pretty cool story because again, this goes on to the whole exploration of the Green Lanterns. This goes on to the whole exploration of, you know, what's going on with these origin stories, how it all ties together and all that kind of good stuff. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.